let's begin. So this is the first week of Language in the Media, and our very first question is, what is media? So we already know what language is. It's what most of you have been studying for certainly the last year. We know, as it says in the definition here, that it's a system of spoken or written communication, and that it's different in lots of different places around the globe. What's media? Well, that's the question that we're going to be turning our attention to this week. And there are different types of definitions. So it is a means of mass communication, so like newspaper, radio, television, film, and so on. They are all part of the media. But it can also be an actual thing, as it says on that second definition, a physical object, a form of media, or medium, as it says underneath. If you speak to an artist and ask them what media they use, they might tell you, oh, I like using YouTube, or I like using the radio, but it's more likely that an artist will actually say, I prefer using oils, or I like using film. So, media and what a medium is varies depending on the context. And as we go through this term and this module, you'll see that this notion of context and what context a word is used in becomes really, really crucial and important for considering what language is within the media. So you'll probably recognise this type of slide of all of the different languages that we have in Europe and how they fall into different families. So some of that might come in useful even when we're thinking about language in the media, because we do live in a global age. We are seeing lots of different languages being used online and being used in our mainstream media and also being used every day around us. But the things that we really need to start going back to at this point when we're thinking about what media is that very first original canonical type of communication. So the best type, the most perfect type, if you like, of communication is that without a medium. This is the type of communication that we all learned when we were infants. It's how we learn to speak and to communicate. There is no medium, there is nothing getting in the way. This is basic face-to-face communication without a medium. And it's one of those that, particularly at the moment, in the middle of a global pandemic, this is really difficult to do apart from those few people that you can have contact with, because they are within your bubble or within your family, so that you can actually meet them and speak face-to-face, communicate face-to-face, and also perhaps without a face covering. So, communication without a medium has become really quite complicated now in light of the global situation. So, bear that in mind as well. What is this global pandemic doing to the ways that we communicate with one another? The very first media, the very first type of communication that we still have a record of historically, are cave paintings. And I'm sure you're also aware of very early sculptures. So this is at a time before written language. So instead we have, of course, people communicating face to face, talking with one another, but also being able to record a form of communication in the way of pictures. And these are cave paintings from France, Lascaux, which is a very famous set of caves where these very, very early pictures can be found. And what's interesting about them, and we can't see it in this particular image, but you may have seen others where there are handprints. And very recently, it's been suggested that these handprints were actually made by women because the hands are actually very small, the prints are very small. And up until recently, it was considered that it must have been the case that these very early people were a lot smaller than modern people. But actually, there's now been some further thinking on this and further research done on this, and now the thinking is coming around to, well, perhaps actually these cave paintings were completed by women, because in these very early societies, we know that these were hunter-gatherer societies. Well, the hunters, who were men, went out and did the hunting. The women were at home raising children, living in caves and small shelters and so on, and eventually then raising crops and so on, but gathering berries and shoots and various other things. But they were the ones who actually had more time and more opportunity to actually be able to do these cave paintings. So it's quite likely that cave paintings were our first female artists. So this is also an important point to bear in mind throughout any research that you look at, but particularly things that are sort of historical, is, who is telling us this? What's their interpretation? And what are they basing their interpretation upon? Because we've seen so much change recently and widening of who we think is actually communicating. Is it always a case that communication is coming from organised groups who are primarily, particularly when it comes to history, white, male, middle class and so on? Or actually, is there a wider spectrum of people that information could be coming from? And is it the case that we are interpreting things through a particular lens? So bear that in mind too. Who is doing the communicating and also who is doing the interpreting? So the first books, these arrive after, of course, we have written language, and these first early books, things like the Book of Kells and, very, very early books, Bibles in general, these were not printed on paper in the West. Instead, they were actually, and in the case of this illuminated manuscript that we can see a picture of, these were generally hand-painted, handwritten on vellum, which is actually rabbit skin. And that's one of the reasons why we still have them, is because that has lasted far better than perhaps some of those papyrus scrolls that we have from the Middle East. But certainly in Western and particularly Europe, it's Western Europe, it's very much, that these are on rabbit skin vellum. And they're all hand copied. There was no printing in these very first books. So the picture that you can see there on the left, that monk copying things out, that's how the very first books, and particularly these were religious and extremely expensive because they were hand copied, which does allow for mistakes to be carried through. So, the method of production we also need to think about in very early forms of communication. How is this being communicated to us? And is it possible that there could have been misprints, but this isn't printed, but sort of miscopied? Who were the people, again, controlling this particular form of communication? And this was very much being controlled by the church, the Christian church. And what were they allowing to be passed down and passed along? And remember, so from these very early books, and certainly, sort of the medieval period up until the arrival of the first printing, not many people could actually read or write. Instead, it would only have been very sort of educated people, educated men who went into the church, and they were the ones going to university, the few universities that existed back then. Generally, people didn't learn to read and write, and instead, all of their information came verbally, shared around the kitchen hearth. And in church. So this is why, of course, we have stained glass windows that often, the early ones, depict various different Bible stories so that priests could tell their parishioners, they could tell their congregation the stories without having to read books, because books were expensive. They didn't exist widely. There may have been only one Bible per parish, and that may well have been the only book that existed. And we're talking about, as I say, very sort of early times, the Dark Ages and so on. Certainly in Britain, this is before we have the sort of the arrival of a lot of recorded history. So certainly before 1066. But then in the 15th century, we have the very first printing press. So all of those hand-printed Bibles, handwritten Bibles, and handwritten books, and any form of written communication that we still have, dates generally, if it's handwritten, from before 1440, which is, as I say, when we have the arrival of the first printing press. So everything was hand illuminated, hand copied. Then in the 15th century, we have the beginnings of a mass media. But it's not really mass media. It's still a very slow and expensive process. You can see in the wood carving on the left there that, yes, there is printing going on, but it's quite slow, it's laborious. We don't have the same sort of mechanical press that we're going to see in the next slide. So it's very much still a hand completed process. So printing proper arrives with the arrival of the Industrial Revolution, which really doesn't begin until the sort of about the 18th century, so the 1700s. And it's then that we start to actually have a mechanisation. And there are lots of reasons why it arrives then and why the Industrial Revolution is so important. The thing to remember here, though, is that the Industrial Revolution, by and large, is centred upon Western Europe. And it begins pretty much in Germany, Northern Europe, and in Britain as well. So we have this arrival of printing, which means that it becomes a lot easier and cheaper, importantly, to actually start producing printed matter. So that means that communication can actually spread certainly throughout Britain. And it means as well that we start to see the necessity for people to learn to read. And the Industrial Revolution also brings with it some mechanisation in farming practices too, which then in turn means that we start to see factories arrive, and there isn't the requirement for such labour-intensive practices within sort of British commerce, which then means that we have the arrival or the rise of the middle classes. So all of these things are sort of closely related and dependent upon one another, and it's actually with the arrival of mass communication and printing in the 18th century that we start to see also the rise or the arrival of the novel. So all of that happens, and then in the 20th century we have the arrival of the digital revolution. So we had the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, and in the 20th century we get this digital revolution, which we are still experiencing even now as things continue to progress. So this is a screen grab of Amazon's website from 1995, and you can see that this is not image rich. It's very simple, pretty much grayscale. Yes, there's blue there, but that's pretty much it. It's not exciting to look at. It's very simple, very pared down, and yet when this came out, long before the majority of you were born, this was amazing. And back then, back in the 90s and even into the 2000s, Amazon was really known first and foremost for books, and not as it is now, our sort of one-stop shop for everything. Right, so we're going to pause here. So we've got some central questions to start thinking about, and I want you to think about these questions before you start the next part of the lecture. Do participants use language differently in media discourse than we do in face-to-face communication? And think about what that meant before the arrival of COVID-19, and also think about how face-to-face communication and media discourse and language, how we're using it differently now that we're all online a lot more than we were even a year ago. Think about that second question there. Do the various different types of media involve different types of language use? Do we communicate differently when things appear on the television to how things are online on the web? Is radio different from television, and how is it different? What sort of additional bits of information do we need if we're listening to a radio programme compared to watching a television programme, for example? How are newspapers different from Twitter? Think about all of those things. Also consider whether language change, whether that's actually accelerated. Are we seeing new words arriving a lot quicker because of the media, and particularly social media? What new words have you started to use, perhaps? Even the mention of COVID, the coronavirus. How has that changed our world? What sorts of new words are we seeing and hearing, whether we're seeing them online or actually hearing them when we're talking to people, in face-to-face communication and interaction? What about when we're going into shops? How are we interacting with people differently now that we've got this global pandemic? Also think about whether this notion of free expression and the media, is it okay to say what we like online? What responsibilities does having a voice online and a profile online, what responsibilities goes alongside that? So, do consider how the media is changing at the moment, incredibly rapidly and on an almost weekly basis. Things are altering. And changing. Will they continue to change? Will they change permanently because of the virus and the pandemic? Or will things go back to how they were before? And think also about the ways in which the media use language. Are they manipulating us? How do they manipulate us? How do they influence us? So give those things a thought. Give those things some thought. You might want to go to the forum now on Moodle and actually start shaping some of your ideas as well.